This is Aquanox Deep Descent. I was interested when they said they were going to bring back the Aquanox series because this is a series that hasn't had an entry in a long time, and to the point where really nowadays a lot of people don't even know that it was a series. It's been so long. The series actually started quite a while ago in the DOS gaming days back with a game called Archimedean Dynasty in 1996. A really interesting 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter that actually came out the same year as another really good 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter called Hellbender, which I really need to get around to covering. But anyway, it was lauded for its weapon variety and its interesting just DOS shooter atmosphere that games of that period had. And in 2001, they released a sequel simply called Aquanox, which is where the series gets its name, which is kind of where the identity of the series mostly comes in terms of how it's considered in the modern day. It was an underwater 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter, and if you don't know what that term means, because it's been a while since we've seen very many of them, think games like Descent and Forsaken, games where your movement is in a three-dimensional world, and you have separate control of rotation, height, movement in every direction, strafing forward and backwards, all that stuff on separate controls. It was a pretty popular genre for a little while, and then it kind of fell by the wayside, along with like classic roguelikes, space sims, CRPGs, when the world of PC gaming became less popular for a while, and now that it's coming back again, we're seeing a resurgence in all these genres, and this is just another one of those that we're seeing more of. And Aquanox was a pretty interesting game. It was a bit janky, it had some weird aspects to it, but it was really neat, because games where you're underwater, deep underwater, exploring an underwater world, were not that common, and the whole 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter thing is generally in space or some sort of zero-G environment, so having one underwater was novel at the time, and it still kind of is, honestly. And I remember personally being really impressed with the lighting effects in that game, because your weapons and things had dynamic lighting, so firing energy weapons lit up your cockpit and stuff, and it made for a really nice atmosphere. And then in 2003, Aquanox 2 came out, which I don't remember as much about, to be honest, because I don't think I played it nearly as much as the first Aquanox, rather. But that was the last game in the series. So this series has been dormant for 17 years, and now suddenly they've brought out another entry in it. That's more of like a soft reboot kind of thing. It doesn't really take place after or in tandem with any of the other games, and is just sort of more its own thing, but in the Aquanox world of Aqua, which is simply the seas of Earth after the surface has become uninhabitable from disaster, and you are basically tasked to explore, understand the factions, and find out what's going on. In this version of Aquanox, you actually play as 4 characters at once, technically, which is sort of interesting. You have a ship that is manned by 4 characters, and you do have a dialogue system, which makes it kind of odd, because chances are if you click a dialogue option, you don't necessarily know which of your 4 characters is going to be saying it, and sometimes this creates really weird situations where you will choose a dialogue option, and then the dialogue option directly after that is a choice for one of your other characters to react to what you just chose. It's kind of strange the way the dialogue works, because you're 4 characters at once, but it does the job, and this also means the game does have a co-op feature that allows you to individually pick any of those 4 pilots and actually pilot separate craft with them if you want. So story-wise, it involves your 4 characters waking up from cryosleep in this new world and trying to figure out what's actually going on, attempting to understand the various factions that you'll find and their motivations, and then of course there's some more superhuman mysteries with some other beings and some Borg-like entities called Bions and a couple of other things involving this mysterious project that you're a part of but don't remember, and the whole concept is you're just exploring this new world, trying to figure out what your role in it was supposed to be, because you all have amnesia and you're trying to figure out what's actually meant to happen in this world to save it. There is a plague of these bioluminescent plankton all over the place that sort of represent the game's version of invisible walls, which give you a very clear indication of where you can and cannot go, because if you go into these fields of plankton, they will deal tremendous damage to you very quickly, and the entire surface of the water is covered in these things, so they tend to create a sort of ceiling that lets you know where you can and cannot go. Gameplay-wise, it's actually mostly a pretty classic 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter feel, although one of the degrees that you can normally use in games like Descent is a rotation, usually bound to Q and E, allowing you to rotate in place. You cannot do that in this game, I assume because you're underwater, and when you're underwater there is still technically an up, so you can't just rotate freely, but all of the other degrees of movement, strafing backwards and forwards, up and down, are all available to you, and the movement is actually a pretty good system in the game, because you have a couple of different forms of boosts to help you move around and dodge enemies and make the combat a bit more interesting. You have just tapping the boost button expends these pressure charges that will jet you in whatever direction you are moving at the time a certain distance. These are useful for like strafing around torpedoes or getting in and out of cover quickly to try and avoid bullets and things. It's a useful system, and every different different ship that you can pilot has a different number of these charges that all recharge independently. And you also have an actual boost meter. If you hold the boost button instead of tapping it, you will engage this, and it allows you to just move more quickly as long as you're going forward. So this is mostly used for just locomotion around the sea floor, but can also be used in combat to help get you around cover and stuff more quickly. So the combat and movement in general, very similar to the original Aquanox, is slower than your average 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter because those tend to take place in zero gravity environments and the like, and they're very frenetic, especially games like Descent and Forsaken, which were very fast, very frantic combat. Aquanox has always been a little bit more deliberate than that. It's not exactly slow, but it's slower than those, mostly because you're underwater, your ship has a different sense of weight because you are in water and not in zero gravity, and the overall combat takes a more, I'm not going to say cover-based, but a more sort of dodge-focused approach of going in and out of cover and trying to dodge from torpedoes and lasers and stuff, and then retaliate in kind as quickly as you can and then get back into something safe, because you can't take that much damage, honestly. You do have a shield that recharges, but your hull, the damage on that is permanent until you either dock somewhere or use a repair kit, of which you can only hold 3 at a time. So it is definitely a bit of a slower paced shooter than what some of the more classics in this series are considered. You also have 2 weapons at any given time on your craft, and you can switch between all sorts of different weapons. It looks like you can only equip 2 at a time, but actually just pressing the 1 and 2 keys allows you to switch in between all the weapons that you have unlocked, so you can actually have all of them at once, which is nice, honestly. And the weapon variety is pretty good, although not quite as good as the original Aquanox. You don't have things like the plasma cannons and the Gatling lasers, but you do have some pretty fun stuff like miniguns, cannons, torpedo launchers, rail guns, and a couple of other interesting things like that, and even some more experimental stuff like these homing missile launchers that fire biological warheads filled with those plankton and do like a damage over time burst wherever they land. So there's some neat weapons here, and although the lighting effects aren't as impressively dynamic as the original Aquanox, they're still pretty fun to use, and I will say the overall impact of the weapons is not exactly what I had hoped for. If you go back to games like Descent and Forsaken, those weapons had a lot of impact. They had really good sound as such. They had a nice glow to them when they fired. It added to a really nice, satisfying sense that the combat had. And the combat in this does feel a little bit lighter, a little bit less impactful, which is unfortunate, especially because you're underwater, so the chances for the combat to feel more slow but impactful is definitely there, and that's kind of how the original Aquanox felt. And this doesn't feel quite as grounded, you could say, because the weapons just feel a little bit weaker, the effects are weaker, the sound assets are weaker. It's just not quite as satisfying and chunky as you might hope or expect, but it does do the job, and the combat is still pretty enjoyable in general. You also will have a couple of secondary weapon slots, depending on the ship that you're piloting. Some have a couple, some don't have any, and these are automatic things, usually turrets, mine layers, things like that you can toggle on and off, and you will also have 2 ability slots. They can equip all sorts of things like a large mine, an EMP pulse, a temporary shield, a missile barrage, stuff like that. They're cooldown based abilities that help to accent the combat with some other things you can use except for your main primary weapons. Exploration-wise, it is kind of an open world, but not in the traditional sense. It's not one big map, it's actually a whole bunch of small maps strung together with warps, kind of like how like earlier space sims worked, where you have like warps between sectors and each sector is kind of its own little self-contained area. It's a bit like that, but underwater. And it does get a little bit confusing to navigate, I'll be honest, because sometimes it can be hard to remember which of the portals in which area leads to which other areas, but you have a map that you can access at any time, and if you zoom out far enough on the map, you can see how every area connects. It's something that takes a little bit to get used to, because these are fairly small areas individually, and they're kind of strung together in a bit of a chaotic way, so you have to put some effort into remembering how you get around this world, although luckily there are objective markers for these side quests and the main missions that will lead you through the right gates in the right order if you get lost, and you even have a little beacon thing that you can use that will guide you around the terrain to where you need to go if you get super lost, which can happen occasionally, especially in areas where you go in sea caves and other places like that where you're not in the open waters. So all of this so far sounds pretty standard. It works quite well. It's fine. It is a fine game in pretty much every aspect in terms of its general combat, its story. It all does the job. It's fine. However, I do have a couple of problems with some of the aspects of the game when it tries to get a little fancier than I feel that it should. Basically, it seems like simple is fine sometimes. Simple is alright, and the original games, and indeed a lot of games in this genre, are fairly simple. It's usually just you, your ship, a bunch of enemies, and a large place to explore. And this game shines when it is that, when it's just your team, your ship, and a bunch of enemy ships, and areas that you can explore, salvage, fight, and things like that, when it's just simple 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter underwater action. However, when it tries to get a little more fancy than that and add some extra stuff on top of it, it tends to kind of fall over a little bit, and it makes it clear that there was a bit of a budget for this game that didn't seem to allow for some of those extra things to really get fleshed out in any meaningful way. And the biggest examples for me are the AI in the game. The AI is really not very good for a lot of the things that you'll encounter. Now, oddly enough, the actual main enemy AI, the AI of the ships that you're fighting, is fine. It works just fine. It will dodge shots, it will use their abilities on you, like EMP pulses and missile barrages. It will even be able to dodge railgun shots and stuff if it has some of its movement pulses left. So it's, it works just fine. It makes for a pretty nice shooting experience with all these enemies. But the other bits of AI in the game that don't involve these ships are where it starts to get a little bit weird. For one, you'll also be fighting biological enemies, fish infected by this plankton scourge underwater, and they can be sharks, eels, large whales, jellyfish, all sorts of things, but it doesn't matter what they actually look like. They all do the exact same thing, and their AI is incredibly simplistic. They all will simply just rush towards you in the straightest line possible, and then just sort of poke you. That's all they do. They rush towards you from wherever they spawn, and if they miss you, they'll just U-turn around and rush towards you again over and over and over until you kill them or you get out of their way. They are not really much of a threat at all because they don't do that much damage, and their AI is so simplistic that just avoiding them is really easy. Just go in a straight line faster than them and they will never be a threat to you at all. And in fact, destroying them, actually killing them, is kind of pointless because they spawn pretty quickly in some areas and they don't give you anything for killing them. So you'll be using resources on them that you aren't getting back. You won't be getting scrap or materials or ammunition or anything back. So really, they just seem to kind of exist to waste your time more than anything else, and they're simply best ignored, which makes me wonder, why are they really even there in the first place? Because they don't have much of a function other than to be a slight annoyance, and it seems like it would be better without them because they don't really provide any sort of extra interesting gameplay by being there. But my biggest problem with the game is the friendly NPC AI, because it is really weird. It's incredibly inconsistent and it's prone to being very buggy. Even the tutorial AI bugged out on me, and that's never a good sign. The tutorial AI just flat out refused to continue the tutorial and go past a certain door, and just sort of rotated in place infinitely and just got frozen, stuck there. And I had to actually save and reload the game in order to sort of reinitialize his AI and actually be able to continue the tutorial at all, which is a huge problem, and the AI in general seems to be plagued with problems like that. This problem becomes even worse when you think that there are actually quite a few missions where you have to escort or otherwise defend other AI, and they're just not really interested in self-preservation at all, and it makes these areas of the game very frustrating. There was one mission where we got ambushed, and I had to suddenly defend these people that were before trying to kill me, and now I suddenly had to switch to defending them, which was fine from a story perspective, but the AI was so broken in that fight that I failed that mission about half a dozen times before the dialogue warning us of this ambush even finished, because they just stood there. They all sat there, the enemy sat there, and they just torpedoed them to death within like a couple of seconds. I barely even got enough time to lock onto one of the enemies and start trying to fight them before the mission simply failed over and over again because the friendly AI just wasn't interested in living and just kind of sat there. And I actually ended up having to make myself bait and just boost as fast as I could in front of all of these enemies at once to get their attention away from the AI, which wasn't doing anything, in order to even pass this part of the game. That's a problem. The friendly AI is just so frustrating to deal with that, like I said, the game shines when it's just your team and your ship fighting other ships as enemies and exploring these areas. When they try to add anything on top of that, these creatures, these friendly NPC escort missions, the other NPCs exploring with you, anything that gets a little bit too fancy, it just kind of falls over and makes it clear that it's not really meant for that, because none of that works nearly as well as just the simple foundational 6 Degrees of Freedom, you and enemy ships gameplay. There are a couple of other just sort of frustrating control problems and things as well, like for instance there is no VSync option, there is no mouse sensitivity option, which is kind of a big deal, so you either like the default mouse sensitivity or plug in a controller. Those are pretty much your only options, because there is a controller sensitivity option, confusingly enough, but no mouse. And there's also no weapon selection radial or anything like that I can find. You simply have to switch between your weapons in order by pressing the 1 and 2 keys. So if you want to switch between your left weapons, you have to press the 1 key. If you have like 8 weapons in the slot and you're on weapon 7 and you want to be on weapon 6, then you have to press the 1 key enough times to switch all the way from 8 back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you know, all in order like that. And it makes switching between your left and right weapons really tedious in just a control scheme that doesn't need to be that tedious. There's no reason for that. There's a better way, a lot of better ways to do weapon switching and stuff, and that's just not one of them. Overall, I like that Aquanox is back. I like that THQ Nordic decided not to just sit on franchises. They tend to actually, you know, reboot or reimagine or do something with some of these old names they have, which is really cool, and I respect them a lot for that. But this is clearly a budget release that tries to do a little bit more than its budget allows for and kind of falls over when it tries to get a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. I would say wait for a sale on this one because it is still an enjoyable 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter with a pretty nicely made underwater atmosphere. It's just a little bit too janky, a little bit too rough around the edges, and that NPC AI that you have to rely on a little bit too often to do things that it doesn't seem to want to do very much makes it more frustrating than necessary in certain segments of the game. And I don't think I can, in good conscience, recommend that people go and buy this for its full price, which is $30. I think that's a little bit too high for the experience, which is best when it's as simple as possible, and I think maybe waiting for a sale when it's maybe like $15 or $20 would actually be pretty reasonable because there is an enjoyable foundation of a game here, but all that extra stuff on top of it just kind of makes it fall over at times. So an interesting game nonetheless, and I'm glad that it's being made because, you know, seeing some of these older franchises redone or having new interest being put into them is always a good thing. You know, classic PC gaming franchises coming back is nice. So that's my personal opinion on Aquanox Deep Descent. Wait for a sale perhaps. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.